Welcome to Film at 50, a podcast that celebrates semi-centennials in the world of cinema. I'm your host, Brian Rowe, and I'm so very honored to welcome Michael Phillips to the podcast today to talk about a big one, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, starring Julie Christie and Warren Beatty, and directed by Robert Altman, released 50 years ago in June of 1971. How are we doing, Michael?
Good. Thanks for having me on, Brian.
Thanks so much for being here. I've been a big fan of your work for many, many years, both in print and on television. I wanted to start. Yeah, I started watching Siskel and Ebert in the 90s as a, lover of movies when I was a kid. I did not miss an episode, even though it was syndicated, right? I would find when it was airing. And after, Roger Ebert got sick, Richard Roeper started having guest hosts. And what was it, about 2005, 2006, you started coming on the show a lot, and that's when I really got to know your work.
Right. Thank you. 2006, 2007, and then I spent most of a season with Richard, and then a couple of years later, A.O. Scott and I had the final season of the shows, which was fun, great fun too. So it was a real. I'm just like you, 20 years earlier, Brian. I didn't miss an episode, and unfortunately, I still dress like those guys did, sweater, a lot of really drab, kind of beige sweaters, there must be something just, I don't know, in the Midwestern catalog of fashion.
Some of your reviews are online. I don't know if you might know this. There's a website. I think it's siskelebert.org, and it has videos of a lot of the old Siskel and Ebert episodes. And just in the last 3 or 4 months, they've started adding some of the Ebert and Roeper. And so I just watched one with you talking about the worst of 2006. It's on there now. You can watch it. You talking about the Da Vinci Code and All the King's Men. It's very, very fun.
Okay, good. I'll check it out.
Yeah.
I'm just narcissist enough to check it out.
And the review, I always think of you and Richard talking about The Dark Knight. I remember there was so much anticipation for that movie. And I want to say the two of you reviewed it maybe 1 to 2 weeks before the film came out. So there still wasn't a lot of reviews released. And I remember watching your segment and I went, oh, this is going to be really great. So I'll never forget that segment you did with Richard Roeper about The Dark Knight. It was such a great conversation the two of you had.
Good. That's good to hear.
So I wanted to go back to the beginning, Michael, if you could talk about what initially got you interested in film. Was there a single movie? Was there a family member or a friend that got you into movies when you were younger? Kind of what got it started for you?
It's a great question. It's I sometimes think there was a week somewhere in 1969 when I was 8.
Okay.
When I went up to Milwaukee to see 2001: A Space Odyssey with my mom. We lived in Racine, my mom and my dad and my brother, but I was certainly into the movies more than my brother. And I liked science fiction vaguely. I was interested in the moonshot coming up in '69, and we went up to 2001. And I was really wiped out by it. Didn't get hardly any of it at age, I was either 7 or 8 at the time, I think. And on the way home, we back to Racine, I asked a lot of questions. And my mom is a very pleasant, patient, easygoing, wonderful woman. And she really just kept saying, I don't know. I don't know what the... I asked about what is the obelisk? What is that rectangle? That metal rectangle? What is that? It's just, and she eventually I've kind of falsified this in my head, but at some point I think she actually pulled over and said, I'm sorry, I don't have a single answer for you. So that was that. Meantime, I think that same month, I swear to God, I saw The Love Bug 5 times. So somehow just knowing that movies could encompass a range that included Herbie the Love Bug and Hal, the malevolent computer. I thought, well, wow, that's crazy. You can't, I'm endlessly curious about all of it. So I think that's how it happened.
And then once you got into high school and college, were you studying film? Were you writing about film very kind of early on? When did that get started?
In high school, we had a pretty good student paper that was actually more of, I think it only came out 4 times across the 8-9 months, so it was really more of a quarterly which meant, it was terrible for news value in terms of currency. But if you were writing about, I wrote about Taxi Driver, to talk about an unprepared, what would that be, 15, 16-year-old. But to encounter, work on the order of Jaws and Taxi Driver and Star Wars, it was a pretty great time to be bumping around. And the 70s were just sort of fascinating anyway, because there's such a huge shift before and after something like Jaws and Star Wars, especially in the late 70s. But the movie we're talking about tonight, of course, lies at the very beginning of the 70s, and it's just antithetical to a mass market blockbuster like Jaws or Star Wars.
Yeah, this McCabe and Mrs. Miller came out in the summer. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, this is not what we really think about as a summer release, right?
The summer picture.
Middle of late June of 71. What was it like, growing up watching films of the 70s as a teenager? It must have been a lot of fun to see like all of the different kinds of films coming out of Hollywood. It's such a rich decade for movies.
Yeah, and I McCabe belongs to a different period because I was too young to seek that out on my own. I was R-rated. I wouldn't have, it was not quite old enough to quite get the deal there. But I will say this, when you look at, when I think of the movies that really had an impact on me from the early 70s that, were probably rated PG, mostly, some G, Cabaret, that carried a PG, and that was, that sort of hit me as hard as 2001, because I thought, this is such a sort of stimulating and kind of terrifying depiction, of the time. And I hardly knew anything about Nazi Germany, in the early or just pre-official Nazi Germany. But that's the kind of work that, was just staggeringly good, and still is. It's still, I think, one of the 2 or 3 best stage to screen adaptations of a musical in the last 50, 60 years, easy. It's a much better film than West Side Story, for example. It's a film directed by somebody who knows how to move a camera. I like a lot of West Side Story, and I'm eager to see the new one too. But yeah, that was wild to see that kind of stuff. And then, my very first R-rated films would have been in some cases, in one case in particular, it was an Altman film. It was The Long Goodbye. And again, I didn't really have the resources emotionally, and you didn't get the context to didn't really know what they were doing with the old archetypal Raymond Chandler, Philip Marlowe character. But it was an interesting entree. And then Chinatown the year after. I saw Chinatown the year after. So it was a really dark, despairing, disillusioned time. And this is just after Watergate. My friend Eric, who's my age, always said, and I love this, he came up exactly the same time, and he was sort of gravitating toward a lot of the same movies that were essentially adult movies, but may have been rated PG, maybe R, whatever. And he said, honestly, it got to the point that if a movie didn't give you a completely, profoundly despairing and unhappy ending, you felt cheated somehow.
So you're like you're watching a Disney movie.
Yeah, exactly. But and I saw, God knows, I saw plenty. I saw $1 Million Duck the year McCabe and Mrs. Miller came out.
The same month.
Was that right? The same month? Fantastic. I'm really glad we don't have to spend an hour talking about $1 Million Duck.
Michael, I just recorded an episode about $1 Million Duck, and we talked about it for 2 hours.
You did?
Well, seriously? Maybe 40 of the minutes were actually about the movie.
Well, how does it hold up? I've never wanted to see it again, but
it's bad. It's very bad.
Why is it bad?
It's very formulaic. You don't really like any of the characters. Dean Jones kind of phoning in his performance. Sandy Duncan just plays like the dumbest, most dim-witted character, and not in a way that's really funny. It's just it's like the script just needed another pass, and just the concept itself isn't very funny. The Disney, we've talked about it a couple times, the Disney live action films of the 70s, not a great time for the studio. A lot of
the one that
bankrupt.
really skeezed me out, really freaked it, like really hated it, and just felt pervy and awful to me, was Super Dad with Bob Crane.
Okay, I haven't seen that one. Is that one of I think that's one of the mini. Is that one of the mini ones with Kurt Russell? He's in like
honestly,
7 of them.
I think so. I don't remember why he was like, he talked about slave labor. He was in every one of them. Yeah, no, he
he broke out eventually. But
there's something about that period of Dean Jones, though. It's true. I mean, he was just clearly like, running out the contract, and like Snowball Express. I remember hating. I remember thinking, why? Yeah, I mean, it's all I wanted to do was laugh, but I didn't.
Yeah. So the live action Disney films of the period, not great, but outside of Disney, at least for live action, a lot of great films of this era. So real quick, before we get to McCabe and Mrs. Miller, I'd love for you to talk about, joining the Chicago Tribune as a film critic, and kind of take me through like after college, like how did you kind of work your way into eventually becoming the film critic at the Chicago Tribune?
I got very, very fortunate right away in college at the University of Minnesota. They had an excellent student newspaper that was very well funded by student publication fees from 65,000 students. And, I was hired on to do theater first year, and I wasn't 18 even, I was 17. And then I didn't know there was any money involved. I remember turning around and then the advisor, whoever, oh, do you know where to pick up your check? No, where? Really? There's a check? So to get paid for your opinion on a play at age 17, when you barely are old enough to drive, is really bizarre and irresistible. I mean, it was a wonderful. It turned out the market, the Twin Cities, as arts and culture and film and theater and music especially, but all things, it was a very, very strong mid-size arts and culture market. So it was wonderful to be on a staff that covered the city seriously, that introduced me to, covering film up there, introduced me to so much wonderful old work that I hadn't seen yet. I mean, I knew a few directors by name, especially Hitchcock and Howard Hawks and Wells, but I mean, so many others were less well known to me as certain directors with certain styles, and I was just relatively new to the international film, so it was a great start. And then I got hired as one of the 2 film critics at the one of the weeklies up there, City Pages. 1983, first review was The Big Chill, I remember, and then a couple of years after that, my first full-time job right out of college was as arts editor of that same Twin Cities weekly, City Pages, and did some writing all through. And then it was really more about theater for the next 15, 20 years, more or less. Dallas newspaper, Dallas Times Herald, San Diego Union Tribune, back to St. Paul Pioneer Press, and then the LA Times called, and all this is for theater. And that was the first time I had ever worked for a paper that size, kind of a different league. And the irony being, the timing felt like, I get my big break, not big break, but like my first big paper at a time when I'm just starting to kind of burn out on theater. I want to get back to film.
Okay.
And then Chicago called, and that worked out. And my then wife and our newborn were kind of eager to get back to the Midwest. And Chicago theater is terrific. So I thought, okay, gotta go. The theater there is going to be stimulating, and life will be interesting. And so we agreed that we go. And then that was a consuming job. I mean, it's so much to cover. And so, 2, 3, 4 years in, I talked to a couple editors to say, hey, if you ever want to make a change, I'm interested in film. And it turned out they were, and it took a year or so to work out. But since 2006, for 15 years now, I've been doing film, which, as you know, Brian, I mean, in film, you don't just cover film now. It's all this sort of nebulous, raging river of content that's streaming on so many different platforms and television. So I'm writing about a lot of different things. Okay. In the pandemic, of course, we're all well, here we are, we're all inside.
Yeah, exactly. And then just real quick about At the Movies, I'd love to hear about your time that last year with A.O. Scott. What was that year like for you, like working on that show together? Was there an expectation that it would continue after 1 year, or kind of how did that go down?
Well, I have to say there was no expectation that it would continue. As we found out, this is the funny part. As we found out, Tony and I, not that long after we, got hired in television, and with that show specifically, but television generally, with that kind of thing, it's just 13-year contract. I'm sorry, 13 month.
13 months.
I wish it was 13-year.
You'd still be doing it.
It was 13 weeks at a time, and then they would either renew or fire, and so we thought, well, whatever, we'll probably get 13, 26 weeks. And, we were, and then we found out that really they just had to run out one more year of the show to satisfy certain other arrangements with stations nationally, others in the syndicated market. So we would have had to just astound them with amazing ratings to be continued, but nobody, and look, even back then, it struck both of us as like two middle-aged white guys. Here we are, and this is the liberals' dilemma. You think, okay, this isn't really fair that we get to sit on these chairs. I mean, we both knew plenty of people, some of whom had come onto the show in previous years as guest host. You think, there's a certain amount of liberal guilt involved, and also just, intellectual fairness. So, like, let's diversify these opinions. So anyway, we did the best we could. And the thing we really found out is that the less we stuck to the formula of just sort of grinding through five movies a week quickly, because we only had 21 minutes to do it in, if you add up the non-commercial time. If we just sort of thought, wow, let's just do 2 movies and talk, okay, one of them is a Scorsese movie, let's just do the obvious but fruitful thing and just say, okay, let's just kick Scorsese around for 10 minutes. I'll do a couple favorites of mine. You do a couple favorite years, and we'll just make sure that we don't do the same films. And we didn't. And those were the ones that did well and got the most favorable response, because we were closer to our real selves, I think.
Okay. Yeah. I really enjoyed your year. I wish it had gone on for more, but at least we have that. I really wish someone would find some more of those episodes, put those online too, because right now I've only been able to find the last one that you did, the very last episode, but everything else I can't find online.
I've heard that. I'm not sure Disney certainly has no interest in finding them and doing anything to kind of recirculate them. But I don't need that show, Brian. I have you and this show. I don't.
Absolutely.
At least for the next 40 so minutes. Here we are.
Here we are. So let's get started. Let's talk about our film today, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, one of the big releases of 71, and definitely a movie that, over the decades, I feel like this movie's become more and more appreciated. I had not seen this movie, Michael, until 2 nights ago. This was one that passed me by for whatever reason. As I said to you before we started recording, I still have a lot of Altman films to see, including a couple of his big ones from the 70s. I'm so very happy I finally got to see this one. So when did you first see McCabe and Mrs. Miller, and what is your take on this movie?
When I was in college, McCabe and Mrs. Miller was a title that would always show up on the repertory schedule when most cities of a certain size had a repertory house that would play double features of recent or older pictures, right? So you'd see McCabe and Mrs. Miller show up on a double bill with either another Altman film, MASH typically, or maybe The Long Goodbye, or you'd see it show up on a double bill with another Western, maybe from the 70s, even if it wasn't very good, like the John Huston film, The Life and Times of Judge Roy Bean, which came out the year later.
Okay.
I remember seeing that too with my folks. So that it would have been then. And frankly, I struggled with it and was a bit bored. I think as a college kid, its rhythms were very sort of elusive to me. And it doesn't have a strong narrative drive. It's about everything other than, it's not for the plot dependent,
Yeah.
and it certainly wasn't for me at that age. So certain things about it I do remember. I did remember though, and always have, and because I think the Keith Carradine character, who's a minor character who shows up, who's kind of the most purely innocent, member of character in this sort of like amazing cast of faces that went on to become much more famous. But his death scene really stuck with me because that's a very sobering moment, and the film doesn't. Altman's sense of humor, which I don't think I saw MASH at that time either. I discovered MASH a couple of years later too, which I loved as like a junior high school kid. I thought that film was just everything. And now it feels like MASH, and to some degree, a lot of Altman feels a little adolescent smarmy. There's always a lot of female nudity. There's always, it's a boys' club. It's active, the atmosphere. That's what MASH is. It's also happens to be kind of the best possible version of a boys' club movie, I think. But McCabe was tough. I just didn't get the hang of it. But then I saw it, 2 or 3 times over the last 25, 30 years. It's not an easy movie to just pop on like at 9:30 at night after a beer. It's not. It needs a little bit of commitment because it is really got a mysterious quality that is not easy to access. And I do find that like the other night when I saw it about 3-4 nights ago too. It takes a bit of adjustment. Everything in your life, right, Brian, right now in 2020, 2021, everything in our lives is made it more difficult to commit to, not a long film, but a 2-hour film that takes its time and just casts a spell and doesn't really work to make obvious plot points or create conventional rooting interests and all that. It's very different from that. But now I think the older I get, the more I'm happy to kind of just fall into it. And again, it's not a film I'm going to revisit every year. I'm not one of those critics or citizens. I'm not a guy who wants to watch anything that he liked in high school. What were the big movies for me in high school? Casablanca, An American in Paris, whatever. I don't want to watch those every year. I don't. Because I think it's not the movie's fault that they work less and less well for you as time goes on. Sometimes you just need to give it some space. McCabe and Mrs. Miller creates its own space. It's already a very kind of foggy, distant, dreamy sort of experience, and it's not. It's got its own thing. But everybody says the same thing. Honestly, in the end, no matter what kind of critic you are, if you happen to like it, it's not like any other Western ever made up till then, certainly, and even since. And it's really not like any other film experience, I think.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I went into it knowing that it was going to be kind of slow. I know Robert Altman is not big on plot. I was kind of prepared for that. What I was not prepared for was just how well Warren Beatty and Julie Christie worked together. I really loved their chemistry and their banter and kind of the way that their relationship evolves throughout the movie. It doesn't go where you think it's going to go. I mean, I would say the last 20 minutes of this film, I was like, okay, wow, this is really not really about their relationship in that last 20 minutes. This is going into more of a direction of, almost like a final, shootout in a typical Western, but done in such a unique and interesting way that's not really at high noon in the middle of town. It's like kind of like off in the snow, like away from the other townspeople. And the movie just kept surprising me. And having just watched MASH recently, it's very different from MASH, right? It's very like tonally and like it doesn't feel. I mean, there's some genuine tension at the end of McCabe and Mrs. Miller that you don't really see in films like MASH or his previous film before this, which is really wild. I don't know if you've seen Brewster McCloud, his December 1970 release with Bud Cort and a huge cast, including Shelley Duvall in her first film, who appears in this movie briefly. And if I had one thing to say negative about McCabe and Mrs. Miller, more Shelley Duvall. She's in it just a little bit, and I wanted more of her. I just love her as an actress.
I know it's a shame that the one scene that she does have with Julie Christie, who plays the brothel madam and the entrepreneur who hooks up with Warren Beatty's character, John McCabe, who just seems to be kind of a shifty, charming, low-key kind of gambler, but then he slowly basically, becomes kind of the prominent businessman in this tiny little mining town being built up as the film goes. And that's the crazy thing about the way this movie was made, right? Because it was, Altman took his crew, his priceless cinematographer, Vilmos Zsigmond, we should talk about just about the look of this thing in a second.
My gosh.
But, and he's got this stock company of actors, a lot of whom we saw in MASH, John Shook, many others, René Auberjonois. I murdered that pronunciation, but and they just sort of set up camp with this skeletal script based on a 1959 novel
by Edmund Naughton.
What's that?
Edmund Naughton wrote the novel.
Edmund Naughton. He was a newspaper man at the Louisville Courier Journal, and he wrote this novel, McCabe, and eventually moved to Paris and wrote for the International Herald Tribune, and then this got filmed in '71, and that made him a little money. But Altman loved this idea in theory of getting the hell away from the studio, just as he had done with MASH, to try to make his own kind of movie. And they were really rewriting every night. And,
oh wow!
And as the film was shot largely in sequence, you saw very little of this town, this makeshift town that's being built before your eyes, tiny little mining town. And then, as the weeks went on with filming, more and more of the town, okay, this building's up now. Now we have something resembling a street. And the town is called Presbyterian Church. It's a very, very, ramshackle little thing. But you see it growing before your eyes subtly. Just as I'd say the relationship between this gambler and the brothel madam, Warren Beatty and Julie Christie, is also kind of growing and changing a little bit before your eyes too. They're business partners. They're also lovers, also off-screen. Beatty and Christie were lovers for a long time. But she's also a businesswoman, and she, the $5 is always on the dresser when they get together. And it's an amazing experience to watch this thing, because you can just see it. It's long form improv on screen. And that's really how it came together. And you sense that with MASH in 1970, because some of that was very loose and unexpected and sort of off plot, but that was more of a gag comedy in the end, with a little bit of seriousness, accidental, maybe accidentally serious occasionally. McCabe is a much more nuanced blend of kind of this sort of pathos and sort of bittersweet sense that everybody's a little bit lost in their own world, I think, and the odds are against them from beginning to end for success. And that's what we see, right? What plot there is in this thing is all about, will McCabe sell out to the business interests who come in and just want to take over and pay him $5,500 to just to give up his asset. And it's a pretty fair price, it turns out. But McCabe wants to bluff him and up the price, and and eventually that's what gets him into what you mentioned already.
Doesn't end well.
Showdown. Yeah, right. I mean, they'd rather send in the shootist to take care of this negotiation than another. Yeah. So it's a very simple story about, and as Altman said, at the time, I remember watching a Dick Cavett episode just the other night when he was on with Dick Cavett from '71, kind of defending McCabe. Yeah, it's worth looking at. And he said, look, this is a movie about a fool. I mean, it's Beatty's playing a fool, and that's a hard thing for mainstream audiences to get behind. And that's why I think McCabe was always going to struggle to find a big audience. It is not that kind of picture, as you said. The idea of this coming out in summertime, whenever it's a tough movie. It's a really tough movie, but I love it. I think so much of it looks just unbelievable thanks to the collaboration between Altman and Vilmos Zsigmond, the cinematographer. And Zsigmond found a way to desaturate the color, and apparently it's known as, and I just learned this, known as flashing the film, which means exposing the film stock to bright light for just 5, 10, 20%, to bring it down 20% or so. And that's why the film looks so damn gorgeous. It looks like an old tintype, but in color. Very soft colors. But when the snow is coming, and that's a rainy film too. It's always raining or snowing, and that's all legitimate bad weather that they had to kind of write around and film around. And man, it all helps the movie, The only thing that dates it, honestly, you may have your Shelley Duvall problem, but that's a good problem. The only thing to me that dates it at all is Altman's signature slow zoom style, where you have a slow movement in that sort of either narrows or if it's pulling out, slow zoom sort of on the return that widens the frame. That feels dated a little bit to me, and that was always Altman's visual strategy, and it feels sometimes like a tick or a cliche, I guess. It also seems a little 70s.
Okay.
And nothing else about that film seems 70s. Even the Leonard Cohen songs, and this is what I love, and then I'll shut up. The Leonard Cohen songs that run throughout this soundtrack were not written for the film, but man, I mean, they all sing and talk about gamblers and luck and lost love and all that, and it couldn't work better. And now that we're 50 years later, thanks to your show, we're looking at it, right? 50 years later.
50 years.
We're 50 years since McCabe first came out. At this point in history, it feels to me like Leonard Cohen and the setting of this film, which is the late I don't even know when it's set.
Is it 1902, I think?
Okay, 1902.
I read 1902.
Okay, 1902. It all feels like now, from this perspective of the 50-year difference, from when it came out to now, it feels like Leonard Cohen was alive back in 1902 to me. And those songs don't feel like a contemporary sounding comment on the action. It's truly like part of the texture.
Yeah, I love the songs too. And after the first one played, I had to look up who. I tried not to go on my phone, Michael, when I'm watching these films for the podcast, but I just found that opening song so striking, and I was like, oh, Leonard Cohen, really cool. And then I read up on how Altman, he was trying to find the right tone for the songs and the music, and he just could not land on anything until he came across Leonard Cohen's work. And I read that Cohen gave him 3 songs because he was a fan of Brewster McCloud. He had seen his previous film. And so he said, I'll give you some songs. And so, I don't think this movie would work as well without them. It's that long shot of Julie Christie leaving at the end. He follows her walking away, and we have a Leonard Cohen song playing over that. It's just gorgeous. And you need that, I think, to really. It just does
not sound like the Leonard Cohen we've heard over and over, because it's a whole different time in his career as a young man then, and this is it's just a wonderful sound and quality. I think it's this movie has nothing to do with, say, something like The Graduate 4 years earlier, which was a huge cultural smash. Everybody went, but I think to the degree the Simon and Garfunkel songs are now bound together with the images from The Graduate. That's exactly how the Cohen songs work for McCabe and Mrs. Miller.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit more about the photography. It got a BAFTA award nomination. This movie, I assumed this got at the Academy Awards. I assumed it was picture, director, actor, actress, and it didn't. The movie, I guess, took a while for the critics to really come on board, because even though I think Roger Ebert called it a perfect Altman film, I'm not sure in the year of 1971, not everybody was on board with this yet, because its only Oscar nomination was for Julie Christie for Best Actress, and then it got 1 BAFTA nomination for the photography. So, so kind of interesting to me. And I mean, obviously, a lot of great films in 71. We'll get to The French Connection and The Last Picture Show and Harold and Maude, among many others, but I mean, I feel like this is top tier, so it kind of surprises me that it didn't do better at the awards.
It is, but those films you mentioned, and I have a big, they do all the work for you. Those films, they are right. They're not all the same kind of film, God knows, but McCabe is just this little poem that sort of floats, and it's it just didn't have any machinery in the narrative, and you couldn't sell that movie to the heartland or even the big cities. As you said, a lot of the critics just couldn't access it. They also had a very hard time, unless that film was viewed by civilians or critics in optimum audio conditions. That this was Altman in his early years of experimenting with this multi-track sound recording, where you had a lot of different conversations with different mics picking up fragments of it, and then you kind of find your mix after the in the edit. The McCabe soundtrack, just for the voices alone, is very challenging. You know, there's a lot of deliberately obscured and muffled dialogue. There's a lot of fragments that you hear clearly, but they're not being spoken by characters who the camera's actually focusing on. It's just conversation that's happening essentially just off camera. It's all very interesting, but this is where it's actually best to experience McCabe, I think, now in a good crisp edition, the Criterion Collection edition, or just make sure you have decent audio when you see it, because then you can at least hear what Altman intended to do. And by the time he got to Nashville in '75, the technological advances and what he was up to about, he had a 24 character panorama and to kind of deal with in that picture, and the same kind of sound experimentation about getting fragments of the dialogue and just one sentence here and another one here and 5 things going on. But the tech was so much more sophisticated even just 4 years later. It wasn't as tough to for the average audience to just sort of keep up with it and kind of just flow with it.
Yeah, there were a few scenes in this movie. I watched it. I had recorded the film off of Turner Classic Movies, so I didn't have access to like subtitles. There were a couple scenes, especially at the beginning, when I'm still kind of getting into the pace and the groove. That scene at the beginning where they're playing cards and there's like 5 or 6 guys around that table and they're all talking over each other. I was struggling a little bit following all the dialogue. I tried to turn it up as loud as I could, but once you get into the groove of the film, especially when you have scenes of 2 or 3 people, it's fine. There were a couple moments where you'd have a big group, but that's also an Altman trait. So I was kind of ready for that too. So
right. I think the tone is what, because it's not a comedy like MASH was, and it doesn't make its intentions known. You don't really know, what you're supposed to think about a lot of the characters, especially, what are you supposed to feel about the central relationship between McCabe, the entrepreneur and gambler who's, his own worst enemy really, and Julie Christie, the brothel man who, is often lost in this opium haze and just wants to get the money and move on to San Francisco and open up her own place. And now a different you could make on that kind of relationship, and really even this source material of the novel, you could make an entirely conventional connect the dots kind of movie, and maybe even with the same 2 actors, we could talk about Beatty. I mean, a lot of people think this is one of his very best performances. I think it is too, but I'm not sure in the end. He really didn't like working with Altman.
That's what I've heard too, yeah.
He didn't like giving up the control. He didn't like being decentered in the frame when his name is in the title. Some of this is just guesswork on my part, but it's just not, it's not a conventional star vehicle in any way, even though it's got 2 big stars in a movie that's named for the 2 main characters. But you can just tell, I think temperamentally, Beatty was intrigued to work with him, especially because MASH had been such a hit. But I think, I'm guessing around week 3, week 4 up there in the snow and in near Vancouver up in Canada, he's probably wondering, I remember he's probably thinking back to Bonnie and Clyde when he really basically became co-director and co-director and he's as a producer, his fingers were everywhere, and this is different result, but I still it's still a moment in time for those 2 performers. It's Beatty and Christie sort of at a certain point in their own relationship, and I think the tenderness that you see occasionally, and also the sense of a misconnection which you see is got a kind of a strange touch of autobiography in it.
Yeah, I loved Beatty in this. He's kind of hit and miss with me, throughout his career. I really liked his look in this. I like that he's not playing too strong. He's got a vulnerable side. He has kind of a weak side to him, as he does at times in Bonnie and Clyde, which is, such a landmark film that he had done just a few years before this. You mentioned that he didn't get along so well with Altman. There's this great story I read online where Beatty wanted to do more takes and Altman said no. And so Altman left, and then Beatty kept performing to like an assistant, and Altman wasn't even there, which I thought was really, I'm like, how often does that happen in filmmaking? Do big figures like that. But yeah, I thought, originally Altman wanted Elliot Gould to play this role. I don't know if you knew that. Like, so they worked together on MASH. Yeah, he offered the lead role to Elliot Gould. He turned it down. He just said he didn't feel right for the part. And Altman told him, this is the biggest mistake you've ever made in your acting career. And so, yeah, so Elliot Gould, they would then work together 2 years after this, right? And in their 1973 film together.
The Long Goodbye, yeah.
The Long Goodbye. And I'm not sure how many times after that they worked together, but so yeah, he wanted Elliot Gould, and it took getting, I believe, Beatty to watch MASH. Beatty took a look at MASH and said, I want to work with this guy. But yeah, I don't know, on the set itself. I mean, gosh, that last 20 minutes, Michael, is that all Warren Beatty out in the snow, like dragging himself along? Like, and if they shot this film in sequence, which I read that they did for the most part, I bet those last few days, as you say, Beatty was like, get me out of here, but I think he's really great.
By then, yeah, I agree. And by then it does turn into a different kind of a more familiar and very satisfying, I think, kind of Western, because it is, one man against the three killers sent to get rid of him. And there's other things going on at that point, without, spoilers. I mean, there's a fire and the townsfolk are dealing with that. And, there's a lot going on, but by then I think if you seeing it again the other night, I remembered, okay, it takes a while to get through these, the first 20 minutes is going to take a rhythmic adjustment.
Yeah.
Because there's all you're establishing is what's going on in the one kind of prosperous saloon in town. And you kind of hear little bits and pieces about what Beatty's plans are for opening up, prostitution business. And, you have to pick up some of that, but a lot of it's just scene setting, mood, and atmosphere. And then around the midpoint, you're either sort of in it or not, but I found it much, it gets easier and easier because you're a little bit invested. Slowly, you're invested. And then by the end, some people find, that climax is really kind of conventional, one man against his killers, right? Ending, but by then it looks very different. I mean, Zsigmond, the cinematographer, talked about that's the one section of the film that's shot with real clarity, sharp edges, bright, looks like a Hollywood movie, but a good one, And then of course when you cut to the inside scenes, the interiors, from there to the exteriors, which are really snowy, that's just that's a Western climax we haven't seen before. And it's got a lot of, I don't know. A lot of people think it's his best movie. I mean, people who don't really like Altman especially much and think he's maybe a bit shallow or,
too improvisational, maybe.
Well,
in some of his other work.
Easy cynicism, I think, is the rap. that the pervasive sense of cynicism or disillusionment is, in some cases, it doesn't quite pay off in enough ways. Dave Kerr, who I really love a lot as a critic, who's now a curator at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, but he used to be at the Tribune and the Chicago Reader. He thinks it's easily Altman's, for him, his best couple hours ever. And he's not alone. And Pauline Kael at the New Yorker really helped keep that film alive in the face of a lot of audience indifference and critical indifference back in '71. Ebert being an exception too. But if you can, and it's online, but if you can find Pauline Kael's review, I found that it's utterly evocative of her reaction to it, and also just the actual film that was made, as opposed to the kind of film that other people might have been describing it as.
Mm-hmm.
It's a Western, but not really. I mean, you have to, there's so many caveats describing this thing, you know.
Yeah.
It's a love story, kind of, you know, it's a Western.
A little bit.
It's, I mean, you know, yeah, it's just not, you know, but anyway, that's, but yeah, let's talk about some of the Warren Beatty stuff.
Yeah. Oh, some other Warren Beatty films you want to point out? Yeah. So in my podcast, every episode, we do a segment on, you know, beyond the flick. What are some other films we like? And so, yeah, while we're on Beatty, who's really strong in this, this period of his career is not great. His other two films of this part of his career are The Only Game in Town with Elizabeth Taylor and Dollars with Goldie Hawn, two films I watched recently. Not so great, much more formulaic kind of movies. This is easily the strongest of those, coming off of Bonnie and Clyde. But what are some of your favorite Warren Beatty films, or films he directed, or both started?
Well, real quick. I mean, he had a kind of interesting career, because his first big break was he got a Tony nomination in a William Inge play, I think in 1959, for a play called A Loss of Roses. Big flop, Inge's first big flop after a lot of hits, after Picnic and Dark at the Top of the Stairs and Come Back Little Sheba and all these. Big flop, but Beatty got noticed, and Elia Kazan hired him for Splendor in the Grass, his screen debut, 1961, and he made quite an impact. And a lot of people couldn't tell yet if he was a good actor or just simply a really good-looking guy who could act a little, you know. And it was hard to tell, frankly, the first time out. And a lot of Beatty's work, almost all of it, in fact, some of it was very interesting, but almost all of it, between the hit that was Splendor in the Grass and then the real landmark hit that was Beatty as producer and star, Bonnie and Clyde in '67. A lot of that work was really negligible and box office indifferent. And, you know, he was sort of considered kind of he didn't really pan out. And then Bonnie and Clyde came, and that changed things. I think people who don't know Beatty, you know, from really through the career, there's 3 or 4 I'd mention. I'd say see Splendor in the Grass, just to see what the fuss was about.
Yeah.
And Inge actually won an Oscar for Best Original Screenplay for that, and that was kind of his last hurrah, because he had a lot of difficulties and flops after that, both on stage and in the movies, but mostly on stage, I guess. But I'd say see Splendor in the Grass from '61. See Bonnie and Clyde if you haven't lately. And then the other two, I guess, would be, you know, another one that's kind of emblematic of the '70s, and another film I was at age 14 a little too young for, Shampoo. Have you seen that?
Okay. It's been a long time. Another film that paired him with Julie Christie.
Right.
Lee Grant, one of my favorite character actresses. She won an Oscar for that film. I want to revisit it. It's been a while, but I remember it being a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's good, and it's sour, but it really captures that era, and just the feeling really well. And I think if you haven't seen Bugsy, the Barry Levinson film from '91, you know, I'd seek out the longer version of that. There's an extended cut that's about 15-20 minutes longer than the theatrical release cut, and I don't even really know if.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah, I don't really know if Beatty is quite right as the mobster Bugsy Siegel, because he doesn't really have that much of a jagged edge or an air of danger to him naturally. He has to really work at it, Beatty. But you know, it's a pretty good film, and I haven't seen it again in a long time. I'd like to see it again. It's also scripted by the now notorious James Toback, who, you know, flamed out in multiple cases of sexual harassment and assault. So it's I don't know how some of that's going to play now, but I remember loving a lot of the dialogue at the time. And so Bugsy, and you know what I saw again for the first time in years and years was Reds, which is certainly the biggest gamble and the most money Beatty ever played with, the biopic of the little known, back then especially, American journalist John Reed, who covered the Russian Revolution and became a real force for communism, but sort of a conflicted one. And it's he and Diane Keaton. And you know, that film is not a classic or great, but it's got wonderful things in it. And Jack Nicholson is almost, I don't think, ever been better. He plays Eugene O'Neill, but those are a few titles.
Yeah, and Maureen Stapleton, I believe, won an Oscar for that film. I think if you're going to pick a few Warren Beatty films to see, I feel like Reds is kind of essential. I mean, that's the film that won him an Oscar for directing. It was kind of his big movie. I also like Dick Tracy. That's one of the first films I saw in a theater. I don't know how well it's held up. I haven't seen it in a while, but I just remember loving like the kind of the energy of that movie and the colorful characters and the great ensemble cast, including Al Pacino in a really fun role. And I also really like one of his early films, All Fall Down, which I discovered on TCM a few years ago.
Right.
With Lansbury and Eva Marie Saint, and just a great cast, kind of a family drama. I love the look of black and white cinematography of the 60s. I just love the look of that film. I think it's really interesting. I think it's his third film he made.
Yeah, that's a William Inge script too. There's another one that is really bizarre called Mickey 1 from '65. And
Arthur Penn.
Arthur Penn, and that's a really odd role unusual role for Beatty, because he plays this sort of neurotic nightclub comedian, almost like a Lenny Bruce type, which is like wild to think of, who's on the run from the mob. But you never, it's almost like theater of the absurd. You never, it's not realistic. You never know why he's being chased or being hounded by the mob. Is it in his mind? Is it, whatever? But it's also, I'm kind of crazy about it just because it's location filming in Chicago when nothing was being allowed to film there. And you see things like the Marina Towers being built sort of around it. And it's a strange picture. It doesn't really work. Very indebted to the French New Wave. This is also the wonderful thing just bring it back on the way out to McCabe and Mrs. Miller. People refer to it, the cinematographer Vilmos Zsigmond referred to it as, McCabe was really part of an American New Wave that didn't feel heavily, obviously indebted to specific films and filmmakers from Europe. It really did feel like pure Americana of a certain type. It's not nostalgia. It's not warm and sentimental. It's completely Altman's vinegary kind of flavor, having his way with a genre and kind of subverting it a bit, but not in a flip way. I mean, he had a very flip, cynical sense of humor, no question about it. Sometimes it's wonderful, sometimes it doesn't work at all. But in McCabe, I don't know. I mean, Kale's review is kind of an epic. It's that you can't help but use some of her language. It just feels like it's all a castle in the air. It's almost like, did it really happen? Could it have? But what I like about it is it does actually feel like you're getting a slice of frontier life as it probably might have looked and felt as it was being built. A little town in the middle of nowhere. Yeah, okay, we got a reason for a town. We got a mine, a silver mine that's still active. Let's build a town, and you never see movies about a tiny little town in this nascent state. And that's why when you asked me pair it with something, what would you pair McCabe with? With something recent?
Yeah,
I would pair it with Kelly Reichardt's First Cow.
Great choice. Yeah, I just watched that recently.
Yeah, it's set much earlier in the history of the American West, Oregon Territory, several decades earlier. But this town, I guess it's a town in First Cow, kind of out of the middle of nowhere, enterprising entrepreneur, oily cakes. We got a product we can sell, and then of course larger forces come in to kind of conspire against it. Is it a tale of American capitalism running amok? Is it just another kind of, ravagement of the American West in many ways? There's a lot of interesting parallels. I really love First Cow too, but it's a very different film from McCabe. But I think just in terms of like this community, this weird makeshift community, trying to set down and get some sort of life going in the middle of nowhere back then. I think it's a good bookend.
Yeah, that's a great film. My choice was The Revenant. It had some similarities, especially in terms of the kind of the snowy photography, the Western setting. We have a real visceral scene of violence at the end, and so there were some similarities I noticed between those. I feel like if you're going to look at film, like how it has evolved over 40 plus years, I think The Revenant might be an interesting film to look at if you haven't seen it before, or if it's been a while since it came out. But yeah, First Cow would be an excellent choice as well. As we wrap up here, Michael, any final thoughts about McCabe and Mrs. Miller or the career of Robert Altman in general? Do you have any other kind of recommendations for Altman's career? Because there's still a bunch I haven't seen.
Yeah, I mean Altman, he had such intense highs and lows,
Mhm.
and he could make 3 or 4 in a row that would just, it seemed so sort of half-hearted and just barely hanging together. But the miracle about his good work is that it also is barely hanging together in a way. I mean, McCabe, it's a miracle it works as well as it does, because it was such an, as I said, an exercise in long form improv where they're rewriting all the time and they're just kind of creating this community to see, okay, let's try to tell the story our way. I think I just saw California Split again, and that's another that's a seemingly more commercial mainline kind of a comedy about 2 compulsive gamblers, Elliot Gould, George Siegel, sort of riding a streak up and down. And but that, you see that film too, just like McCabe, and you think, how the hell did a major studio give these people the freedom to make such an off-center version of a movie that could have been a big mainstream hit? But it wasn't. But it turned out so well, from my perspective, that I'm glad that they didn't have more commercial dictates all over it. I mean, Spielberg actually at the time was also considering that script after he did Sugarland Express, I think.
Oh, interesting.
And he told Altman at one point, or told an interviewer, I forget, he said that, I mean, if I had done it, the last 20 minutes would have been the most exciting, suspenseful, are they going to keep the streak going, kind of gambling climax ever. But the one Altman filmed is better. And it's it's such a different thing. But Spielberg is saying, I mean, you couldn't get temperamentally in every way 2 more different directors in Hollywood in the 70s than Spielberg and Altman. And honestly, they're 2 of the most important. So it's a curious dichotomy. But I hope, the best I can hope for, and I'll end with this. I mean, the best I can hope for what's left of modern Hollywood, and as it's evolving into whatever this new iteration of filmmaking and streaming is going to be, I just hope that the bandwidth remains as wide as it was in the 70s, but in the 70s it was all white men. Spielberg, and I just hope the bandwidth and the opportunity just widens out as it's doing. TV so far is a lot further ahead than film, but if we can just open the damn door to more types of filmmakers, we'll get the stylistic and every other kind of viewpoint range that this world we live in now just demands. So that's what I hope. But anybody who has a taste for McCabe and Mrs. Miller, it's so off-center and counterculture. It's still counter to almost everything we know and think about what a movie's supposed to be about or how it works and all that. And it's still kind of a great example of what you can get away with within the confines of studio filmmaking with a little bit of money. It wasn't a big budget picture, medium budget, but honestly, it's a great argument for the return of the medium budget picture.
Absolutely. Agreed. Well, thank you, Michael, so much for being here. This was such a thrill. Just hearing you talk about this movie actually makes me appreciate it even more. It makes me want to watch it again. So this has been so much fun to talk to you today about McCabe and Mrs. Miller. Is there anything you want to promote or tell our listeners where they can find you online?
Now and then you can hear me on Film Spotting, a great podcast out of Chicago. It's aired on Chicago Public Radio. It's also at filmspotting.net. And I was on a couple of years ago with University of Nevada, Reno's own Catherine Fusco.
Oh, perfect.
A wonderful professor and a really good writer. And we talked about Casablanca. So you can look in the archives on filmspotting.net and check out the Casablanca episode if you want to hear Fusco and Phillips and the hosts. But anyway, thanks for having me on. You run a good show, Brian.
Oh, thanks so much for being here. And thanks to all of you for listening. We will catch you next time. Until next time, remember, 50 never looked this good.